Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Pacific Wellbeing Mental Health Podcast. I am your host, Jennifer, and it has been a long time since my previous podcast. Life gets in the way, and that's okay. We have to be good to ourselves and take breaks when we need to. And if we're really busy, we shouldn't try to overwhelm ourselves. But speaking of people who are really, really busy, I'm getting into a really interesting topic today. I'm talking about Keanu Reeves, the actor. That's right. What does he have to do with psychology? Have a listen and find out.
As the saying goes, hindsight is 20/20, and to fully appreciate and truly understand an event, it can only be realized after the fact. Whether that be a world event or something closer to home, we often need to sit back and process the situation before we can fully understand its impact.
What is our aim?
2020 became one of those events. 2 years on, and we're just now starting to realize the long-term impact these events had on all of us. And in some cases, it's divided us more than ever. The COVID pandemic was just the beginning. From bread making to Tiger King, social unrest to UFOs.
The Navy pilot who recorded this not behaving by the normal laws of physics.
This podcast will unpack the year that we collectively lost,
during this pandemic.
how it brought us closer together while keeping us socially distant.
Social distancing can make a difference if done.
Starting Thursdays in March, Hindsight is 2020, an original podcast from Story Monkey Productions. Available wherever you listen to your podcasts.
All right, welcome back. So we're talking about Keanu Reeves today. Now, despite being a massive box office draw and meme persona, Keanu Reeves is intentionally private, and much is unknown about him. After the launch of the John Wick film series in 2014, which, by the way, is absolutely stunning. If you haven't seen it yet, check it out. After the launch of that, Reeves entered the collective consciousness again to such great heights that an entire issue of an academic journal called Celebrity Studies was dedicated to decoding the enigma that is Keanu Reeves. I recently had the opportunity to apply some psychoanalytic and trait theories of personality to Keanu, given what is known about him in the media, about his demeanor, his actions, his beliefs, obviously because I don't know him in person. So while I tell you about these psychoanalytic theories, trait theories of personality development and how they apply to Keanu Reeves, I'll also talk a little bit about the differences between the two theories in the context of culturally sensitive psychology. So when we're talking about personality development, psychoanalytic theory and trait theories are quite different, but they do have a couple things in common. And one of these is that the origins of your personality development and psychopathology, so psychiatric or psychological disorders, are assumed to be like internal to the person, not externally created. But then they're very different. Okay, so when we're talking about psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalysis, we think of Sigmund Freud. He was famous for, he's like the godfather of not just kind of psychoanalytic thought, but a lot of people think he's kind of the godfather of psychology because he's the one who really brought it into the mainstream. And don't forget, his theories were all predicated on studying childhood sexual development, the Oedipus complex, dream analysis, of course. And he thought that personality developed as a consequence of a person's internal drives and forces, the majority of which were unconscious and sexual in nature, and that these could only be brought to the consciousness through his methods of psychoanalysis. Trait theory is very, very different. it states that most of our personalities kind of inherited and it's already determined for us, although there's a lot that we can do to consider the person and situation kind of combination and context and how these might affect the development and maintenance of our traits. And when I talk about traits, it's talking about things like extroversion. So we're going to talk a lot about that because it's really applicable to actors. So both of these theories think that, our personality is generally consistent over time and that psychological disorders are, like I said, a function of our internal world. And I'd like to break here for a moment by talking about the fact that I don't really adhere to psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic theory. It's not really my thing, but of course we all study it when we're in psychology. And it's important to know where psychology came from and how it developed. So I don't adhere to the tenets of psychoanalytic theory, although I do think there's a lot of importance that came from it. And similarly, although I think trait theory is very, very important, it doesn't completely describe one's personality. So there's much more that's needed. I actually practice by more of a social cognitive theory, and I'm more of an integrative counselor or psychotherapist. Anyway, back to these major schools of thought. I looked specifically, now some of these terms are going to start getting technical, but bear with me. I looked specifically at Melanie Klein when I talk about psychoanalytic thought. She built on Sigmund Freud's theories. And when we talk about traits, there's a few different ways of looking at it. So I looked at the big five, okay? So we're going to start talking about the big five trait theory first and how Keanu Reeves could be explained in some ways. His personality development could be explained in some ways by the big five traits. But first, actors. Actors are of psychological interest because their profession has very little job security and requires performances and a lifestyle that could be quite anxiety-inducing and open to scrutiny. They're really putting themselves out there. And so there's been a lot of long-standing debate about whether actors kind of need to have some sort of subclinical mental illness that really causes them to choose and thrive in their profession, and whether their creativity is sparked by pain. Now, researchers and the public in general have assumed for a long time that actors are narcissistic and highly extroverted. But it's unclear whether these traits are needed to become an actor or if they come once you're an actor and you've got this celebrity status that goes along with the profession. When we think about people like Robin Williams, rest in peace, there's a few reasons why we think that maybe actors do have some sort of psychological disorder. Robin Williams was pretty out there. He was pretty nutty in a funny way. And so one of the things we do is we kind of, if we already believe that actors have some sort of psychological disorder, we look for evidence to support our beliefs, and that's called a confirmation bias. So if you're somebody who already kind of thinks that actors must have some sort of pathology, then you're more likely to look at people like Robin Williams and say, see, there's proof. There's another thing that comes to mind. It's the availability heuristic, which means that people like Robin might quickly come to mind. And from him, we generalize then that all actors are nutty and goofy, like Robin Williams. Now, these are just a couple theories. Those might lead us to believe, however, that there are more kind of mad geniuses in the arts than they would actually be diagnosed, okay? So the point of all this is to say, people have often assumed that actors are narcissistic, extroverted, and To put it in simple layman's terms, they must be crazy to choose acting as a profession, and that their creativity is sparked by some deep psychological trauma and pain. But because of confirmation bias and the availability heuristic, it's probably not as true as we might think it is. Okay? So I wanted to kind of get that out there. Okay, so there have been some studies, however, to support the notion that maybe some actors do have mental disorders on a different scale than the general public. So, one report in 2018, for example, showed that some actors do tend to score significantly higher on narcissistic disorder or obsessive compulsive personality disorder than non-actors. Actors also tend to score significantly higher than the general public on extroversion, agreeableness, and open to experiences. And male actors tend to score higher than female and than male non-actors on neuroticism. So these are all part of the big 5 traits. But despite these kind of reports and assumptions, very few people have evidence or suspicions of Keanu Reeves having negative traits or psychopathology. So what I wanted to do was score Keanu Reeves on the Big 5 Inventory 2. Now, this is a tool for personality assessment, and of course, I don't know Keanu personally, so this is not by any means actually scientific. Of course, he should be filling this out himself and having it marked by, his own therapist, rather than some stranger, me, reading articles about him in the press and in psychology and scientific journals, and then trying to assess his personality on this basis. But it was fun. It was fun to do. So I scored Keanu as having 56 out of 60 on open-mindedness. Now, open-mindedness takes into consideration curiosity, aesthetics, and creativity. So that makes perfect sense for an actor. I scored Keanu at 48 out of 60 on conscientiousness. That considers how responsible and organized and productive somebody is. And I'll talk a little bit more about these facets and how they apply to Keanu in a second. I also scored him on agreeableness, which considers your compassion, your respect, and trust that people have in you. So how trustworthy you are and how much respect people might hold for you. And he did well on that too. He actually got 54 out of 60 on my attempt at scoring him. Now, for negative emotionality or neuroticism, depending on which tool you're using, those are the 2 different terms. And for this one, it was a little tricky because I'll address why in a second. But so Keanu got 46 out of 60 on this one. And this one considers things like anxiety and depression and emotional volatility, so anger. And then extroversion, which we all know, and we all know applies to people in the arts, in the industry. Extroversion deals with, how social you are, how assertive you might be, how much energy you expend and show people. And this is the one where you automatically think of Robin Williams, right? And you would assume that actors score really, really high. Well, from what I did, Keanu only got 38 out of 60. So that's a pretty lower middle range on extroversion, bordering almost on introversion. So very interesting. much lower than one would expect an actor to receive. Diving in a bit more, actors tend to score higher on extroversion, having what we refer to in the business as histrionic personalities. They're very attention-seeking. So you can see that people who are more social and assertive and have high energy would score higher here. And this makes sense for actors because they need to give positive first impressions in auditions. They have to focus on their appearance. They have to. And they have to kind of fulfill their drive for that flair for the dramatic, and they're being rewarded by being the center of attention. So this is one of the ways that Keanu Reeves does not fit in with society's perception of celebrities. I mean, he eschews the star trappings of being always in the spotlight and out there. He can be quite shy and introverted, as many reports say of him. Several authors note that Keanu is actually quite a reluctant celebrity, intentionally remaining an introverted enigma that defies categorization. And he refuses to participate in discussions that would give people a deeper glimpse into his inner world and his thoughts. You know, it's funny because that in itself is a bit of a power move, and it's a bit more like assertive, actually, which assertiveness helps you score higher on extroversion. But if you think about it, you know, he's controlling his own narrative there by not talking about himself as much as others do. And the more inconspicuous and normal that he seems, he stands out more and is more noticeable from other celebrities. Now, that's a real power move if you think about it. But still, it makes him come off as more introverted and thus doesn't score as high on extroversion as we would assume. So by all accounts, Keanu is a very kind and generous person, and this is reflected in his score on agreeableness. He ranks high on compassion, respect, respectfulness, and it's unsurprising given the positive media surrounding him. You know, as evidence of him being high on agreeableness and lower on extroversion, Keanu Reeves is known for the selfless acts of charity that he does while refusing to publicly discuss them. Oftentimes, these acts come out into the media only much after the fact and only because other people have told the stories. He doesn't talk about how great he is, which is another thing that makes him great, honestly. His modesty is so uncharacteristic for someone with such a large fan base and a decades-long Hollywood career. He has been called a saintly figure, a beacon of humbleness and goodness in turbulent social and political times. He's been called the internet's boyfriend and the world's kindest celebrity. And, you know, there's really no evidence out there to prove otherwise. So maybe that's because he's a master. If you want to be cynical, maybe it's because he's a master at keeping things quiet. But, you know, generally when people treat each other in a very less than pleasant way, it comes out eventually. And there's no such stories about Keanu Reeves. Now, this deification of him, you know, godlike status, it reflects his giving nature. He is always so kind, interacting with fans in public. There's Twitter accounts called Keanu Doing Things, and it's just like showing him being nice to people. He waits in line for food with the crew on film sets. He does not have that diva treatment. He doesn't demand the diva treatment. And he gives up his seat on the subway to complete strangers. Dude still rides the subway, you know, so, I mean, he does not have this diva lifestyle, this absolutely demanding persona. And he's been called a role model for adhering to positive values and being down to earth. He's also been called a respectful feminist and the epitome of cultural sensitivity and diversity. And, you know, he's clearly shown he's not threatened by strong female characters, strong females in his own personal life, homosexuality, or ethnic diversity. And this goes in both films and real life. So he's got this empathy trait that he embodies on and off screen. that just makes him a better actor and a better person. And he's able to take on the emotions of his characters and respond to the emotions of others. This is something that makes someone highly empathetic and agreeable, according to trait theory. Now, for actors, this can also place them in a position of emotional vulnerability, because if they're really into the role, and especially if you're a method actor, and a method actor, side note, is someone who immerses themselves so much into their character that they stay in character even when the camera isn't rolling on them, even when they're offset and they're in their trailer, for example. And they're reportedly very difficult to work with during these times. But Keanu never goes full method, although he's very, very committed, but he never goes full method. And no one has ever come out publicly to say that he's difficult to work with. But for some actors, this can definitely place them in a position of emotional vulnerability. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more when we get to the negative emotionality. But first, I want to talk about Keanu and his score in conscientiousness. He has been a successful working actor for literal decades. This is highly reflected by the productivity facet of this conscientiousness. But, you know, some actors will actually kind of develop almost obsessive compulsive personality type traits due to their need to be diligent and perfectionistic and detail oriented. Now, his professionalism is well noted in the media. His dedication has even led to him spending, for example, 4 months immersed in martial arts when he was training for John Wick so that he could do the majority of his own stunts with authenticity. And it's amazing when you watch it. The movies are just astounding for the technical skills. And, you know, he does appear to be quite organized and responsible. But this is where his score went down a little bit because he has had past encounters with the law. One really that I could find where he had a DUI in the 1990s. And he is known for riding, I should say, his motorcycles very, very dangerously. And so when I was scoring him on responsibility, that dropped his score a little bit because of the dangerous motorcycle riding and the one DUI. But I mean, really, he's a good guy. So Keanu scored a little bit higher on the negative emotionality or neuroticism scale than one might expect of an actor. But I mean, really, if you think about it, it makes sense because acting is a very difficult profession wherein a lot of actors actually do have anxiety and depression due to the uncertainty and rejection that comes from their being up for roles, being rejected, etc. And the social isolation that forces many of them to remain in privacy because, you know, their lives are always on demand. People want parts of them and pieces of them all the time. So they withdraw more and more into their own little kind of social isolation bubble. So Keanu has kind of done that, but much of his score on negative emotionality is based off of the sad Keanu meme. Now, if you know what I'm talking about, it's the one where he's sitting eating a sandwich alone on a park bench, and it was just a paparazzi moment. The image went viral, though, and he himself has commented humorously on how the internet has recontextualized the photo because he was not sad. He was just sitting there having a sandwich all by himself. But people took it to be sad Keanu and reflecting his difficult life. Now, he has been open about the things in his life that have been difficult. But for those of you who don't know, his father left when he was a child. He is dyslexic. He suffered from grief for a long time when his best friend at the time, River Phoenix, died of an overdose. His sister has cancer. And this one was a shock to me. I did not know this. Keanu had a stillborn child with a partner who died later that same year as the child. And that partner died in a motor accident. So Keanu lost 2 people very close to him in 1 year. So openly acknowledging this sadness and grief throughout his life makes him so relatable, and one of the reasons that people love him, because we all go through horrible things in our lives. He's gone through a lot, and this extra kind of relatedness that people feel towards him kind of got to the point where there are claims that John Wick, the character, embeds Keanu's own sadness and persona into that film's protagonist. So it's interesting, if you haven't watched John Wick yet, and now you know all these things about Keanu, go watch the movie and see if you can imagine him drawing on his own personal pains in the movie. Now, open-mindedness was his highest score, and that makes sense. As I said, actors need to be curious, creative, but it's not just reflecting his being an actor, but he's also very well read. People will talk about what he's reading on set, and it's incredibly impressive. And he's also read a lot of philosophy, for example, when he was doing his background prep for The Matrix. And he even has a new venture with the Berserker graphic novel. So he really demonstrates the aspects that represent someone with the ability to dream and appreciate aesthetics and be curious and try new things, as is common to many of those who work in the arts. We're going to take a little break here before we get to psychoanalysis.
Have you ever thought of time travel, or if we're alone in the universe? Don't believe that Oswald acted alone, or have seen Bigfoot while camping? Every Friday, Science vs. Conspiracy over coffee dive deep into mysteries and conspiracies, and discuss the weird and potentially unexplainable. Science vs. Conspiracy over coffee is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Okay, welcome back. We're going to dive into psychoanalysis now. Not too much detail, though. I don't want to get too technical because, honestly, I even get lost sometimes reading it. But we've talked about Freud, and we've talked about his childhood sexual urges. Not his specifically, but his theory. Now, there was a woman who came after him in the psychoanalytic school of thought, and her name was Melanie Klein. And I focused on her because she had a little bit of a neat bent on the whole psychoanalytic theory. She focused more on a child's inner world, and she was the first to psychoanalyze children, because even though Freud talked about childhood sexual urges and how they informed the development of your personality, he never worked with children. So Melanie was the first one to psychoanalyze children. That made her very controversial, and I love controversy, so that was interesting. Now, she did share a lot of the Freudian beliefs, especially that the child's relationship with the mother is primary, and she referred to this relationship with the mother as the primary object. Once an infant realizes that the world exists beyond themselves and their mother, the Oedipus complex that Freud talked about, and all of the anger and anxiety that comes with it, comes into play. Now, for Freud, this kind of happened a bit later, but for Melanie Klein, she said it started even in infancy. As soon as the infant realizes that they're starting to separate from their mother when they're being weaned from breastfeeding, if they breastfeed at all. And the grief and loss that accompanies this separation from the mother starts to develop something called the death instinct and depressive anxiety. That's pretty deep, right? So the child begins to kind of organize their experiences into bad and good, love and hate, based on this separation with their mother. To cope with anxiety and threats, they start projecting their negative feelings onto another person. We've all heard of projection. You take what you dislike, what makes you scared about yourself or about your world, and you throw it onto somebody else. So to Klein, when people did that, they became the bad object. So we've got the good object now, and that's usually the mother, and it's usually a projection of your own good self, what you love and feel content and secure about within yourself. You got the good object and the bad object. Now, where it gets interesting, to Klein, hate and aggression came first, because you're feeling, although you feel this innate love to your mom, the first real activation of these forceful feelings and emotions was with the separation to your mom, from your mom rather, and this death instinct, this bad object, this aggression, and that's how we start seeing evil and anger in the world. We're anxious about our survival after being separated from our mothers. So we're trying to think about ways to deal with this anger and aggression. And we start to fantasize, to work through our anxieties. And this is where we focus on the good in ourselves and we project it outwards onto other people. Oftentimes it's the mother. But it's funny because Melanie Klein says that this projection of our own goodness from ourselves onto someone else actually makes love very narcissistic. Are you still with me? That's interesting, right? So love is narcissistic in this way because we're seeing what we like about ourselves in other people. So we're loving ourselves. So, it gets more complicated. But hang on, I'm almost at Keanu. There's one more part I want to talk about with respect to Melanie Klein and her theory, because parents might be good objects, but parents are not perfect, and they inevitably fail their children in some way. And how we, when we are children, how we reconcile these failures contributes to whether or not we eventually develop neuroses or aggression. So we work through our discrepancies between our internal expectations, what we would hope that our parents would be, and our reality. And if it turns out that we have more bad internal objects reinforced in the real world, so what this means is our parents keep letting us down and we keep seeing them as bad objects, and it's reinforced and reinforced. There's a negative effect on our projections, and it's funny because in this way, because of our own expectations, our own internal world is responsible for our own sadness. So really, we're all to blame, right? What they're saying is we're to blame for our own sadness, but we're also responsible for our own comfort. So thinking about the child's inner world and the parental actions, Melanie Klein was also ahead of Freud because this does kind of sound a bit reminiscent of the nature-nurture stance and thinking more about ourselves inside and our parents on the outside than something about Freudian psychoanalytic theory. So I hope that all makes sense to you, because now I'm going to put it in context when it comes to Keanu. When we have loss in adulthood, our childhood depressive feelings are brought back up. And, that makes a lot of sense when you think about people who experience trauma and it keeps coming back. In times of loss, we feel intense anger and guilt. And this can be applied to Keanu. His father left at an early age, and he was very, very close to his mother, and he lost a lot of important people later in life. So if you're looking at it from a Melanie Klein psychoanalytic perspective, yeah, it would make sense for him to be sad Keanu, wouldn't it? In times of loss, we might feel a lot of intense anger and guilt. And this is one way that Klein's theory can definitely be applied to Keanu, because his father left at an early age. He was very close to his mother, but he still lost a lot of important people later in his life. Now for Klein, the way to work it through was to put your words to your fantasies. And this is really reflective of talk therapy, right? And even for children, play therapy is important. And it's funny because That's essentially what acting is, isn't it? It's play therapy. Acting is an outlet that you can expunge those feelings, that negativity within you through your characters. And even when he has had a very few minor transgressions in real life outside of acting, like the motorcycle driving, I've heard he drives his motorcycles at night without the lights on through the Hollywood Hills. And it got so bad. I think he had a major accident and had to have his appendix removed because it burst or something because of the accident. I'm not exactly sure, but maybe this was Keanu acting out his death instinct that echoes the losses that weren't resolved throughout his life. Now, obviously, we were talking about good and bad objects figuring prominently in Melanie Klein's theory. And here's where it gets really interesting about Keanu. He has become the good object to fans who are trying to work through all the toxic masculinity and ambivalence about male celebrities in this Me Too sexual assault era. Through his reluctance to disclose personal information and comment on certain topics publicly, you can really choose your comments and behaviors of his to interpret to support any given hypothesis, just as I've done in this podcast. But so fans are kind of taking what Keanu says or what he doesn't say and what he does and also what he doesn't do to culturally and socially construct this personality to fill a need for a positive male role model with these qualities of purity and kindness. And this is how the public is able to uphold him as the good object, that good that we want to see in ourselves, that we want to see in everybody else. We're allowed to see it in Keanu because of the way he acts or doesn't act. There's been no abuse allegations, no fights, no threats, no impetuous behaviors, acting like a diva. He poses with female fans without touching them, earning him the respect of the internet as a wholesome and considerate person, although some scholars do note that, maybe he's just being a little cynical and litigiously aware because of the Me Too era, and people might, come back and accuse him of things were he to act otherwise. Maybe he's just being smart and savvy. But regardless, there's very little in the world to suggest that Keanu Reeves is anything other than a good person. It's funny because we talked about narcissism earlier, and the way that Klein talks about narcissism as a reflection of your own self-love and good object could apply to him too. Subclinical narcissism might be advantageous for actors because they need to kind of be in love with themselves to be able to get up in front of audiences and casting directors and have that ultimate confidence to win roles and to cope with social situations and rejection. But here's where it's interesting. Narcissists are generally high in extroversion and low on agreeableness. However, Keanu was lower on extroversion, leaning towards introverted, and high on agreeableness. So he really does not fit the stereotypical narcissist. He does not fit the stereotypical actor by any means. And I think that's why we love him. So much of what makes Keanu rate high on agreeableness is, again, a positive reflection of his situatedness in culture and diversity. And psychoanalytic theory struggles to address culture and diversity. If you didn't already know this, let me tell you, Freud and psychoanalysis was developed with mainly white patients who were mainly wealthy women. It does not easily generalize to other cultures. And even in the later days of Melanie Klein, her psychoanalytic theory also ignored differences of culture and race. So this is really different than the big five theory traits because 3 of the big five, so just to remind you, there's extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, negative emotionality or neuroticism, and openness to experience. Out of those 5, 3 of them, conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness, have been assessed to be quite universal. So just remember, conscientiousness is about being organized, productive, and responsible. Extroversion is about being social, assertive, high energy. And these are really simplistic explanations that I'm giving you folks here. I can definitely do a deeper dive if people are interested. And then agreeableness is, about being respectful, compassionate, and trustworthy. And so these are assessed to be quite universal concepts. But it's interesting because other ones aren't. For example, neuroticism isn't applicable to all cultures. There's not a term for it in some cultures. So when we think about Keanu, there's certain ways that his culture and his social and diversity situatedness can be reflective of the fact that these traits can be embodied in him. Because for those of you who don't know, he actually has Hawaiian Chinese paternal descent. Take out the he. And in Asia, the introvert is not looked down upon, but actually well respected and admired. And part of this is because of the whole concept of collectivity. It's a collective society, collectivist society, where they work towards the greater good. And so they're not always out there espousing their own benefits and aiming to just work for themselves, for their own success and getting ahead. Keanu does have Asian lineage, as his father was Hawaiian and Chinese. Now, another thing that's interesting is that Asians, particularly Koreans, which obviously he's not, but they ascribe to this hovering method of taking photos with people without touching, and that's what Keanu does. And so it's interesting that these kind of cultural norms can be seen in Keanu Reeves with respect to his traits. Another thing that makes him more universally loved as a good object is the fact that he is kind of the epitome of duality, sitting on the fence about certain things, because, he's got a somewhat androgynous gender that sits well with all kinds of sexual orientations. Men also love him for his physical prowess, beating people up in John Wick, for example, and women love his sensitive side. Now, again, these are really egregious overgeneralizations when I'm talking about men and women here and what people love about him. They're just examples, okay? So please take that with a grain of salt. He also has an intersectality of race because he's got the English maternal side and the Hawaiian Chinese paternal side. And another really interesting thing about Keanu that makes him universally loved to all people is that he espouses really a lifestyle of minimalism while also being very privileged. So people who sit along that spectrum, wherever they sit, can also find something that they love about him. So when you think about his traits, the agreeableness, conscientiousness, his introversion, and his slight level of potential narcissism, he can really excel as an actor. And that's what he's done. Now, how much of this is actually an accurate representation of the true, private Keanu Reeves? It's impossible for me to say. But examining him in this way has actually been a lot of fun. And it gives us a little bit of an insight into the internet's boyfriend. So what did you think? Do you think that the way that I have assessed Keanu Reeves is somewhat accurate? If you've ever had any personal interactions with him, I would love to know. But I'd also just love to know your opinion. Are you interested in hearing more about the trait theories or about any psychoanalytic theories, or perhaps about the psychology of actors, because I barely scratched the surface here. If so, please be sure to leave me a message in one of my social platforms. I look forward to talking with you again. For now, this is Jen with Pacific Wellbeing Mental Health. The Pacific Mental Health Wellbeing Podcast is produced by Story Monkey Productions.